Welcome to our Embassy Row lecture series. Today we have a very special and very important guest from Ireland, Dr. Pat Walsh, who will speak on the topic of Armenian rebellions in the Ottoman Empire, Pasdermadjian and the Armenian Insurrection. Our guest is a historian, political analyst, and teacher. He has written a number of books about the 1890-1920 period, with particular interests in British foreign policy, the First World War, Germany, Ottoman Turkey, Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. His latest publication was Great Britain Against Russia in the Caucasus, published in 2020. And he's just completing a book on the Second Karabakh War to be published soon. He has also had books published on Irish history and the conflict in Northern Ireland. He is interested in Eurasian geopolitics and UK and US domestic politics. Dr. Walsh received his PhD from Queen's University Belfast, Department of Political Science, and Bachelor's of Science with honors from University of London in Geography and History. Dr. Walsh has written a book that covers the topic he is going to discuss today, the Armenian Insurrection and the Great War, a cautionary tale of betrayal. The book was published in 1917. For some years, I have been following Dr. Walsh's writings and always wished to have him, to invite him as a speaker to Washington, D.C. Well, my wish came true due to the formation of TASCTV, which connects any speaker from anywhere in the world and makes it available for view on YouTube indefinitely. And I want to thank the TASC team today for their efforts. If we do a research in the internet with drpatwalsh.com, it's one word, D-R-P-A-T Walsh, W-A-L-S-H.com, you'll see a true wealth of papers on many topics related to recent Ottoman history and the Caucasus. Well, without too much talk, I would like to introduce Dr. Pat Walsh and thank him very much for taking the time for giving this lecture to us. Here's Dr. Walsh.
Pleasure entirely to speak to you. Okay, so on the first slide, really there's a picture. I wonder, can we show this first slide? Okay. So I mean, the first picture here is Garrigan Pasdermadjian, you know, using his pen name, which was Armen Gero, or Armenian Hero. That's what he called himself. Obviously, your viewers will know a lot of the Armenian revolutionaries took sort of nicknames, a little bit like the Bolsheviks in Russia, and Armen Gero was Pasdermadjian's nickname. And there he is pictured in the Caucasus with his guerrilla band at the outset of the First World War. I think the picture was taken in late 1914 or maybe early 1915. So could I have the second slide, please? Okay, so I wrote a book a few years ago, and it was a collection of Pasdermadjian's two pamphlets that he wrote when he was in America. And I found these really interesting because they give the Armenian revolutionary point of view. And you don't usually see this given in Armenian books because they want to really not focus on this. They don't want to focus on the fact there was an Armenian insurrection and how extensive it was. So here is one of their heroes, but they don't want you to know about him, or they don't want you to actually read what he's actually written. So this is why I found this so interesting. So we published his two pamphlets, and I put a commentary around the two pamphlets in order to give the context of the two pamphlets to explain to the readers, you know. So could I have the third slide, please? So the question is, like, who was Garrigan Pasdermadjian? Well, I mean, he first came to the attention of the world really in the summer of 1896, when he was involved in the seizing of the Ottoman Bank in Istanbul, along with 26 Armenian fedai or fighters. This was one of the really first acts of terrorism in the world. You know, it was really a very, very big event. It was covered in the American press, and it was a really quite bloodthirsty event, actually. It was a combined operation run by both Armenian revolutionary groups, the two main ones, the Hunchaks and the Dashnaks. The leader of the actual revolutionaries was killed on the steps of the bank in the initial assault by his own bomb. And Pasdermadjian took charge of the operation after that. And so that's how he sort of gained his fame. They took 150 hostages, and they issued a series of demands. The plan was to sort of hold foreigners hostage. They wanted to kill all the Muslims in the bank and destroy the target. So it was going to be what's sometimes known in sort of terrorist circles as a spectacular, a sort of a really big event that would awaken the world to the the Armenian revolutionaries' demands. And it was part of a sort of a wider series of bomb and gun attacks that were mounted right across Istanbul over a few days. I think over 100 explosive devices were used in those days. There is actually an account of it written, and it's very interesting. So it's written by a man called Harach or Hayak Türkiye, sorry. And if you move on to the next slide, I'll explain that. Yeah, so there's the Ottoman Bank itself. You know, it was a magnificent building, Harach gives a very good account of the actual assault on the bank. At the very start, the revolutionaries who seized it issued a manifesto, and some lines from it are very, very instructive about Armenian revolutionary groups, because the opening sentence of the manifesto said, we shall avoid no sacrifice in order to achieve our aims. We accept no responsibility whatever for the consequences. The spirit of revolt that has worked into the marrow of our bones will continue to threaten the throne of the Ottomans as long as a single Armenian remains alive. So this was really the ultimate in extremism. You know, it was promising that Armenians would fight to the last man and woman and kill as many people as possible unless for their demands to be met. So, it was an extremist action, and in the account that we've got from Harach, he says things like, the bombs that we used had incredible results. They did not kill instantly, but they tore the victim's flesh and made them writhe in pain and agony. The large bombs made a sound like a cannon and produced panic and consternation. I could hear the continual explosion of bombs and the firing of revolvers. We stayed in the bank for 13 hours. About 150 of the personnel, most of them Europeans, were trembling like mice in front of us. They dared not take a step without our permission. So, this was really, it was terrorism, essentially. So anyway, can we move on to the next slide, number 6? Yeah, so outside the bank siege, the Dashnak bomb and gun attacks went on for 4 days, and there was quite heavy casualties on the streets of Istanbul. Obviously, in those days, the city was made up of many ethnic groups and religions, and it triggered off intercommunal violence, because obviously, if terrorists attack in your capital, I mean, local people are going to get annoyed, and they're going to start taking vengeance against people they identify as part of the gangs or whatever. So it set off a whole series of sort of like running battles in the city. But strangely enough, Pasdermadjian and his friends didn't die in the attack, even though they promised to fight to the last man. they actually they were taken out of the city aboard the private yacht of Sir Edgar Vincent, the owner of the bank, and they were spirited away to France aboard the warship Le Giron. And this was actually an example of how foreign intervention or interference in the empire sort of denied its rights to bring people to justice and run its own affairs. So essentially, you know, this was very characteristic of the Armenian revolutionaries, you know, objectives as well. So despite such an act of provocation, Armen Gero and his fellow revolutionaries, they were actually later pardoned by the Sultan, and they became members, believe it or not, of the Ottoman Parliament later on. So quite extraordinary, actually. So could we go on to slide 7 then, please? Now, after the 1890s, actually things, the Dashnaks brought in a different policy. It's not generally known about, but Pasdermadjian became a doctor of chemistry in Switzerland, and then he settled in Tiflis or Tbilisi in Georgia. And he became a successful businessman connected to the mining industry. Now, this didn't stop him getting involved in the troubles in 1905 in the Caucasus. He led, according to his own account, he led a 500-strong army that was involved in a week-long battle that produced lots of loss of life. Obviously, his enemies were the Azerbaijanis, and he basically got involved in a series of battles in which he makes it quite clear that most of the casualties in 1905 and 1906 were actually Azerbaijanis, and the Armenians, who were better armed, better organized, and were actually the more aggressive party in these conflicts, were actually inflicted the most casualties on the enemy. So he got involved in that. But if we move on to slide 8, I'll talk about what he subsequently did in Turkey. So in Turkey, he actually became a politician. So he was sent by the Dashnaks to represent Erzurum in the Ottoman Parliament. So at this time, there was a kind of alliance between the Dashnaks and the Young Turks, and there was a successful, obviously, a revolution against Sultan Abdul Hamid, and a new constitution was established. So, you know, the Dashnaks worked along with the Young Turks at the start, and it was like a fresh start. Even foreign reports describe it as, you know, like a type of reconciliation between the Armenians and the Committee of Union and Progress. And so this period, you know, from around about 1907, really going up to 1914, was a sort of a constitutional period for the Dashnaks. But it wasn't clear what they were really up to, because even though they persisted in an alliance and tried to get whatever they could from the Ottomans, and they were treated very well by the Young Turks. They appeared on platforms with prominent Young Turks. And but, you know, from around about 1908, 1909, when Britain made an alliance with Russia, the Dashnaks started reverting to type. They started realizing that there might be another opportunity of armed revolt on a much bigger scale, and they started sort of withdrawing from participation in constitutional politics in the Ottoman Empire. So Pasdermadjian did have this involvement with the Young Turks. So it's quite interesting that. He was actually sent in 1914 as a delegate by the Dashnaks to Paris to meet international inspectors who were supposed to carry out reforms in Eastern Anatolia. Now, of course, that's another issue, but essentially what happened is interest was lost in this process of reform because of the impending conflict that was going to take place in Europe. So, you know, this was like aborted. So essentially, we move into another phase at that point. So could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so the Dashnaks really gave up on reform. the reformist agenda. And they, as I said, they reverted back to their normal pre-1900 activities. So essentially, there was an offer made by the Ottomans at the Dashnak conference in Erzurum. Now, it's quite significant that the Dashnaks held their conference in Ottoman territory itself. And basically, this offer was that if the Dashnaks, remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire, if they fought alongside the Turks in any oncoming war with Russia, because it was, intelligence reports at this point pointed to the fact that the Russians were intending to invade. If they did do this, they would be given autonomy and they would be treated lavishly, actually, according to what Pasdermadjian says in his own writings. So for a while they considered this, but in the end they'd gone too far, working with the Russians, running guns into the Ottoman territories and organizing and planning. And essentially, although there might have been some division in Dashnak ranks, the hardliners got the best, and the situation encouraged them to throw in their lot with Russia, essentially. So, this was a really, really monumental decision that they took at this time. So could I have the next slide, please? So in the Caucasus, Pasdermadjian prepares the Armenian volunteers for war. In his own words, he commands a 2,000-strong cavalry unit. It was ready to move into the areas of Ottoman Turkey that the Russians invaded. And his superior was a man called Dro, Pasdermadjian, who afterwards had a career, a very dubious career in Nazi Germany. But so Dro was his commanding officer there. In his 1918 book, Pasdermadjian was keen to stress the contribution of the Armenians to the early Ottoman disaster that occurred at Karamemiş, where really, a large amount of Ottomans were killed, in Enver's attempted flanking movement against the Russians. So, Pasdermadjian stresses the importance of the Armenian role in this disaster for the Ottoman forces at this time, very famous disaster. He claims that in late 1914, 160,000 Armenian reservists of the Ottoman army deserted it with their rifles, and around 20,000 volunteers expressed readiness to take up arms against the Turks. That's the quotation. And he comments that, in quotations again, the Armenian inhabitants of the Caucasus spared nothing in their power for the success of the Russian armies, despite suffering what he described as Tsarist repression over the previous years. Okay, could you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, this is a little Irish angle at this, and it backs up Pasdermadjian's information. And this is a man called T.P. O'Connor, who was an Irish MP. He was actually an MP for Liverpool in the UK, but he was an Irish MP of the Home Rule Party, which got overthrown in 1918. But he was a really firm supporter of the Armenians for years and years. And he stood up in Parliament on a number of occasions, supporting the Armenians and giving their case. So he actually said a number of things. I think you can read that, actually. I mean, funnily enough, I can't see it from my position here. It's too small for me. But essentially, what T.P. O'Connor is saying is that the Armenians contributed a vast amount to the actual British war and Allied war efforts, and he backs up the figures of Pasdermadjian, the amounts of Armenians that fought for the Russian forces, and also the fact that they were given this offer by the Ottomans and they turned it down, and they could so easily have actually fought on the Ottoman side, but they also almost went out of their way to actually side with the Allies, side with the Russians, and help in the attempt to destroy the Ottoman Empire. So could we have the next slide, please? Because there's a continuation. Yeah, there's a continuation of that quote there. And again, T.P. O'Connor is giving the same information there. A couple of other interesting things about T.P. O'Connor is that he was the one that suggested to Masterman about the setting up of Wellington House. So he was actually this sort of like the inspiration. He was a propagandist, basically. He'd worked in journalism for the liberal press, and he had actually suggested, he made the suggestion of setting up Wellington House. Also, T.P. O'Connor appeared on platforms with General Andronik later on, when Andronik was moved out of the Caucasus by the British, when he was going into Karabakh and Zangezur and massacring Azerbaijani. So the British basically kicked him out. And the way they did that was they encouraged him to go on a speaking tour of Europe. And he actually spoke with T.P. O'Connor in London opposite the House of Commons, around about 1919. Okay, so could we have the next slide, please? I think there's another slide. I just wanted to show that briefly. It's an Armenian author, A.P. Hakobian, who also gives us some details there of the Armenian contribution to the First World War and to the Allied efforts. And why we're sort of showing those is really to show you that the Armenians contributed to the Allied war effort. And, you know, this was a substantial insurrection that was mounted. It's often played down by Armenian accounts. You know, there was, you know, some sort of little bits of trouble according to them. But I think, as Edward Eriksson has done in his research, he's shown how substantial this Armenian insurrection actually was. And if you read the Armenian accounts of around 1918, 1919, you see that they're not shy. They're not disguising what they did. They are later on when they lose, but they're not at this point in time. They're advertising their efforts, and in fact, they're being given great credit by people in Britain and people in America and France for their efforts, which are seen as a great sacrifice for the Allies. Of course, they don't get rewarded for their efforts, but they still have their supporters. You know. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So, you know, one of the most famous things was the Pasdermadjian moving forward with the Russian forces to Van. Okay, and you know, we know about the Van Rising, and this was really probably the event that set off the relocations, because it was such a serious blow against the Ottomans, taking over a city and then handing the keys to the Russians. I mean, this really emphasized the danger, the dire peril that the Ottoman state was in. And Pasdermadjian, you know, talks about this in his publications. And he says, and I quote, "The Turkish Armenians behind the front, who have been deported and massacred as early as the month of July," so he has a part of the subsequent narrative, "by their heroic resistance occupied the attention of 4 Turkish divisions and tens of thousands of Kurds, just at the same time when the Turks had such great need of their forces." So, you know, he backs up the things that Edward Eriksson said in your last presentation, that, you know, this was really serious, and it was a coordinated and planned effort in conjunction to the invading Russian forces. Okay, so could we have the next slide, please? So Pasdermadjian notes that despite this resistance to the Ottomans, which cost his people such enormous losses, they were actually treated quite abominably by the Russians. The Russians, it seems, had, as the Armenians suspected, different objectives to the Armenian revolutionaries. Pasdermadjian actually describes this as wanting Armenia without the Armenians. So he does note actually that, for instance, the Ottomans had neatly stored the Armenians' goods in certain buildings, labeled, waiting for their return. The Russian forces actually removed these and either stole them or brought them back to Russia and didn't allow the Russians that had fled to Russia to come back to get them later on when the Russian armies had actually occupied this territory. So this is quite a sort of candid admission in Pasdermadjian's work as well, that the Russians were actually the barrier to the Armenians coming back initially. And he sort of infers, or, he gives evidence there that the Ottomans were actually expecting the Armenians to come back. So that's another little loose piece of information that's in his work. That was what he said. He said, that while the Ottomans were prepared to relocate the Armenians back to their homes, the Armenians' Tsarist allies were actually determined to prevent them from returning. So they wanted the land and not the Armenians. In fact, we should say this, that if we look at the history in that first decade of the 20th century, there was extreme trouble between the Dashnaks and the Tsarists' administration in the Southern Caucasus. There was lots of assassinations. Hundreds of Tsarist officials were assassinated by the Dashnaks. I recently saw a YouTube presentation by Stephen Kotkin of Princeton, and he described the Dashnaks as the foremost terrorists of the time. They were actually more feared by the Tsarist authorities than the Bolsheviks. They were better organized, they were more extensive in their activities, and they killed far more Tsarist administrators and policemen and diplomats, etc., than actually the Bolsheviks at this point in time. And they were regarded as really dangerous. And in fact, that's probably one of the reasons why the Russians decided these people are dangerous. Well, we're going to have to use them as an instrument to get rid of them. So this was part of the Russian objective, which Pasdermadjian then complained about when the Russians started to let them down, essentially. So can we move to the next slide then? So, Baku, the March events in Baku, he has this picture in his book, and I think it says something like, the Armenians defending Baku. Well, the Armenians can't defend Baku because they're in the minority in Baku. So they're defending Baku against the majority, which seems to be a strange way of defense. So, we know the events of March. There was a massacre of about 12,000 Azerbaijanis in Baku. And again, it's the same story. The Armenians are very well armed. They're trained. They're a militaristic people. The Tsarists have supplied them with weapons. They're working at this point with Stefan Shomian in the Baku Soviet, who is basically, he's an ethnic Armenian himself, and they're using the Armenians as their only instrument. The Bolsheviks in Baku are using their only instrument that can actually repress the majority, the Musavat, the Azerbaijani majority, because they want to keep hold of Baku. It's obviously very important for the oil industry. So the Armenians are used as shock troops, and they massacre people in the March events, the March days. 12,000 people are killed. There's lots of British accounts by it. So a terrible event. And there's a picture there in Pasdermadjian's book. Okay, can we move on? Another one? Okay, so there's another picture of the March events, and I think if I can read it right there. There's an account of British account of what happened and some pictures, of the terrible events in March. I mean, they're celebrated or commemorated, I should probably say more precisely, in Baku every year at the end of March as the March events. So there was between Baku and Guba and certain other places, Ganja, there was 20,000 Azerbaijanis massacred by combined Bolshevik Dashnak forces. Obviously, they were working together, not on the same agenda, but essentially to try and repress the majority, the rising Azerbaijan nation. So they obviously had to keep them down, and they had a common interest at this point in time to keep down the Azerbaijan majority, who were generally unarmed, who were generally peaceful people. They hadn't revolted against the Russian Empire. They'd actually served the Russian Empire well in the First World War, And they had actually complained that they weren't allowed to take part in the Tsarist armies, even though it meant fighting against Turkey. So there's nothing, we can compare the loyalty of the Azerbaijanis to the state they lived in with the disloyalty of these Armenian revolutionaries. You know, the Azerbaijanis acted in a very constitutional way, and they were really only motivated into taking up arms themselves by the emergency situation that confronted them in 1917 and 1918, particularly from the Armenian revolutions, who were strolling around the area armed and massacring people. So this is drawn attention to by Pasdermadjian, but he doesn't obviously give the full facts. So can we move on another slide, please? Okay, so Pasdermadjian actually went to negotiate with Kerensky in Russia because they had high hopes for Kerensky. Kerensky wanted to fund the Armenians. He wanted to bring he agreed to the Armenians being brought to the Caucasus front because the Russian lines were starting to collapse at this point in time. They hadn't totally collapsed because Lenin hadn't really got a grip of the situation at that point in time. Later on, when Lenin gets a grip, the Tsarist lines really collapse. But they start collapsing, and the Armenians, the Dashnaks, proposed to Kerensky that the Armenians of the Russian army should all be moved back to the Caucasus, where they would fight, and they would actually keep the lines intact, and they wouldn't desert. These Bolsheviks wouldn't have any effect against them like they would have against Russian peasants. So that's what he did first. But he seemed to give up the ghost with Kerensky. He knew probably he realized Kerensky was a temporary feature, and he went off to America instead. And he headed for America in June 1917 as the representative of the Armenian National Council of Tiflis and as the special envoy of His Holiness the Catholicos of all Armenians, as he says, to lay before the American public and government the sorrows of the Armenian people with the view of winning their sympathy and protection for the indisputable rights of Armenia. So we see sort of a common, a common thing that occurs even to this day, the going to America, the working up of the Armenian diaspora for the war effort and for the Armenian cause. So even in those days, this was being done. And this is where Pasdermadjian starts to write his books. So can we move on to the next slide now? We'll talk about these books at last. Okay, so essentially, he wrote two small books under his name, his revolutionary name, as he waited in Washington for his nation to be granted this great Armenia that they were going to claim at Versailles. The books were called Why Armenia Should Be Free. That was written in 1918, the end of 1918, and Armenia and Her Claims to Freedom, which was 1919. The first of these, the 1918 book, was also issued in a shorter form called Armenia, a Leading Factor in the Winning of the War. And what is it? It's a description of the Armenian Insurrection of 1914 and its contribution to the military efforts of the Great War Allies that was deserving of award at the Peace Conference in Paris. Now, Armenia and Her Claims to Freedom, which was written in 1919, is very different. It's made up of 4 parts: a description of the Armenian nation that is split between Russia, Persia, and the Ottoman empires. The second part, that's the first and second part. The third part consists of a case for a large Armenian state to be established by the Peace Conference. And the fourth part is an argument why the Allies, for their own interests, should promote the establishment of an Armenian state in this region. And we're really talking about forming a buffer zone that will prevent basically the Turkic world linking up Turkey, Azerbaijan, and further on. And the other argument that's used quite prominently is it's like a civilization buffer. The Armenians are a special people. They're a more civilized people. They are like, like a defense against these sort of barbarians in the East, a common sort of theme. And it's very racist. It really tries to appeal to European civilization to insert a type of maybe a colony to an extent, but a buffer really full of Armenians that are going to be able to control the whole region. So that's really what he tries to do. The two books were actually published when the Great War was won, essentially, or about to be won. And this sort of explains why they're so candid, right? Ottoman Turkey was presumably going to pay a very high price for being on the losing side of the war. And the war was a highly moral war of good versus evil. So, you know, Pasdermadjian tunes into this theme in America and in liberal England, this morality of the war, you know, being a battle between Western civilization and the barbarians of the East, including the Germans for that matter. But, you know, that's what he tunes into in the book. And it's very much written on that line, on those lines. It's like civilization against the barbarians. So that's the type of theme of it. Now, it's very candid because they're both written at the precise moment of seeming triumph for the Armenians. Okay, so they can be afford to actually tell the truth. That's very, very important. There's a recognition of facts involved in it, and there's some extraordinary things that are said, really, in it. You know, so can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, great. Now, I'm going to show some of these slides. I can't fully read these because they're a little bit small, but I've got the originals here. So I'm going to go through them. So you might see a slightly different reading according to the slide, but I can quote, these are the quotes that will be up on the slide anyway, on the slide. So in his 1919 book, Pasdermadjian says this: the Armenians from the beginning of the war have stood by and been loyal to the Allied cause in the Near East. And they rendered not only appreciable military service, but also, and this is really important, jeopardized their very existence in Turkey, where more than 1 million of Armenians, men, women, and children, were ruthlessly massacred and exterminated by reason of their pro-ally attitude. Now, of course, it's an exaggeration of numbers, but the important point of this is he's saying that the Armenian revolutionaries jeopardized the existence of their own community. So he was making this point that there was a conscious decision to gamble the existence of the Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire. The Dashnaks knew what they were doing. You know, they didn't ask all the Armenian people whether they wanted this or not, but he says this is what we did. You know, he also says, interestingly, had the Armenians assumed an entirely opposite attitude from what they actually did, in other words, had they bound their fate to the Turkish-German cause, what would have been the trend of events in the Near East, he asks. Here is a question to which it is quite possible our great allies have had no time to give any consideration. But that very question was put before the Armenians in 1914, and with no light heart did they answer it by their decision to join the Allies. Each and every one of them had a clear presentiment of the terrible responsibility they assumed. Those millions of corpses of Armenian women and children which spotted the plains in the summer of 1915, rose like phantoms before our very eyes in the August of 1914, when we decided to resist the wild Turkish revengefulness and its frightful outcome. So he's sort of saying, you know, we know what was going to happen. There was going to be large numbers of people killed, but we did it because it was worth it. And that's an extraordinary thing. And that's the reason why Pasdermadjian is never referred to by Armenian writers, because it's extraordinary what he's saying. You know, he is like gilding the lily, so to speak. You know, he's taking events from the future and saying, you know, this is what what happened, but he's actually saying this is what we expected. You know, and that is problematic essentially for the Armenian case. So he also says, now in October 1918, when we are so close to the hour of the final victory and feel quite safe and certain that the heavy and gloomy days of the summer of 1914 will never return, I shall permit myself to picture in a few words, before I finish, that which would have taken place if the Armenians had sided with the Turks. First of all, those frightful Armenian massacres would never have taken place. So he's saying there would be no massacres there would be no killing if they'd have fought on the side of the Ottoman Empire. On the contrary, the Turks and the Germans tried to win the sympathy of the Armenians in every possible way until the end of the war. So he's giving the Ottomans credit for trying, which is unusual again from the Armenian perspective. Okay, can we have a look at the other? I think there's 2 or 3 slides that are, if you want to move over to the next one, and they have the quotations that I actually read through. If you want to move over to the next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, that one there's an interesting one there because it's written by the translator of the book, A.T. I'm seeing if I have it there, if I can read it there. My poor eyesight. It says here, yeah, I can read it now. I can get a bit closer to the screen there. So his translator, who introduced the pamphlet, says, one purpose the writer had in view, so he's talking about Pasdermadjian, one purpose the writer had in view in writing this booklet is to make the great and generous American public realize that Armenians are not an anemic and unaggressive people with no fighting blood in their veins, that the Armenians have not been butchered like sheep, but on the contrary, have fought most bravely and resisted most stubbornly the savage attacks of the Turks whenever they had an opportunity. So, you know, Pasdermadjian was trying to say, you know, these weren't helpless victims. Well, certainly a lot of them weren't helpless victims. Of course, he doesn't care about the people who are innocent victims, but he says, you know, they contributed to the actual, you know, the war effort to a great extent. So I think there's another one there. Yeah, so that's the one I read earlier. So let's move on to the next slide then. Yeah, that's the one I read early. Could we just move on one more? So in that one there, he's saying, you know, basically if we'd have taken a different attitude. So that's good. Yeah, yeah. So there it is again, you know, as I said, the Armenians from, oh yeah, that's great. So there, that map is included as well. It's included actually in a pamphlet with T.P. O'Connor, General Andronic, and this is also included. It's the map of Armenia, the Greater Armenia, Magna Armenia, which was going to stretch. And in fact, there's different versions of this. I've seen versions of it stretching all the way to Baku and even further west into Turkey. But you know, actually, this one here is a little bit more, a bit more modest. This Armenia here than some of them. But you know, it's a massive area. You know, and you know, you're talking. The problem with this map is this. You know, that there's claims that there's like 1 million people have died, 1.5 million even. Some people claiming, and yet, you know, the population is 1.5 million, maybe 1 million of Armenians in the Caucasus, 2.5 million in total. And if like 1 million people have died or more than that, that leaves 1 million people being able to control a territory of that size. It's just unbelievable. The thing does, you know, it's not logical really, you know. I mean, either not so many people died in the Armenian relocations, etc., and through warfare and all the other tragedies that occurred, like pestilence and disease, or else, you know, this was a ridiculous claim. There can't be two ways about it, really. You know, it's just too extravagant for the figures that actually are projected. Okay, so can we go on to the next slide? I think it might be the last one, or is that the last one? Maybe that is the last one. So let me just tell you then to round off. What happened to Pasdermadjian? Well, after these events, he set his sight on revenge, right? So he apparently helped set up the Nemesis assassination squads. He's given credit for that, which subsequently killed the Ottoman ministers Talat and Shakir in Berlin and the Prime Minister Halim Pasha in Rome. Jamal Pasha was killed in Tiflis. It's not clear whether the Armenians were responsible for that, but, you know, there's some claim that they were, and you know, Pasdermadjian is credited for these operations, establishing this nemesis death squad, assassination squad at the end of the war. But he developed heart disease, and he died in Geneva in Switzerland in 1923. And it said he was a broken man because of what had happened at the end of the day. But a really interesting thing, and I wish there was more research done on this, and if any of your viewers can tell me any more, it would be greatly appreciated, because I sort of discovered that Armengaro had a younger brother, Vahan Pasdermadjian, and apparently he loyally served the Ottoman state during all this time. And Vahan studied at the Harbiye Military Academy in Istanbul, and he became a second lieutenant in the 83rd Division of the Ottoman Army. He apparently fought at Karamemiş against the Russians and actually against his own brother. And he was wounded in the leg during the battle of, Koprukai? And I don't know what happened to him after that. I have no information. But what is true is that Vahan was among 17 generals, 365 colonels, 1,785 officers, and 7,762 Armenian soldiers in the Ottoman army. So Vahan shows that there was another course open to the Armenians in 1914, but the revolutionaries chose to gamble for the highest of stakes. And really what happened to the Armenians in 1915, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 was the consequence of this gamble and the Armenian insurrection that Pasdermadjian describes in his books. So thank you very much anyway. That's the end of the presentation.
Yes, thank you. This is fascinating. Are these in your 1917 book, the one that you published, that we can get from Manzara?
Yeah, they're basically, it's in the book there that the slide shows it, the Armenian Insurrection and the Great War. So Manzara have this book, and basically it is made up, as I said, of the complete two pamphlets by Pasdermadjian, plus about 150 pages of context that I put in to describe. Particularly, I look at the role of liberal England in relation to the whole issue. You know, I look at Lord Bryce, and I look at Arnold Toynbee, and I look at T.P. O'Connor, and all this relationship. And basically, you see, the subtitle of the book is A Cautionary Tale of Betrayal. And why I use that title is because actually in this conflict, in these events, there is multiple betrayals. Because first, Pasdermadjian says the Russians betray the Armenians. Secondly, he says that the British and the French betray the Armenians. But actually, the Armenians betray the Ottomans as well. So actually, the whole story is a cautionary tale of betrayal, because betrayal leads to disaster. You know, if you put your people in the hands of other people who have different interests in fighting in a war, you know, you're putting your fortunes in the hands of other people. And it seems to me this is something the Armenians have done forever and a day. They've done it with the Allied powers before the First World War. They did it, the big gamble in the First World War. And they've recently done it in the 2020 Karabakh War, where they relied on the Russians and Vladimir Putin to bail them out. They just thought that Russia would bail them out in that war. And they didn't make a realistic assessment of the situation that was facing them. And that was really one of the reasons that Azerbaijan won this war, because they had made realistic assessments. Obviously, they had been talking, probably President Erdoğan and Vladimir Putin and Ilham Aliyev had all been talking probably, and had probably arranged for the outcome of the war beforehand, or during the war anyway. The Armenians seemed to think the Russians would just give them whatever they wanted, and would actually fight for them. It proved, again, it was and of course there's probably, if you go around Yerevan today, you'll probably hear of Russian betrayal, you'll hear of American betrayal, all sorts of betrayal, you know. And the thing is just a revolving door. It's like a hamster going around a wheel. you know.
Now, my question is, years ago, when, I mean, I've been hearing about all this the last 60 years since I came to the US, almost always the genocide claim is taken out of context. It was totally isolated, presented in a very peaceful Ottoman Empire. All of a sudden, Turks went wild and they killed 2 million Armenians. Now, with all this information coming out, the rebellions, the insurgencies, do you think there may be some change in this really so totally absurd claim of genocide, and rather present this with its context? Do you see anything, either in Europe or in the United States, any movement to look at this more realistically? I mean, the suffering of Armenians were horrendous. The suffering of Ottomans were horrendous. But it's so warped, the claim of genocide and nothing else, black and white. Do you see any change with all that publications coming out?
Well, I certainly think, you know, Edward Ericsson's work, has really been, you know, it's the concentration of, you know, the idea of counterinsurgency is, you know, is certainly the fact of the matter, and you know, it will you know, be responded to in the West, because the West understands this, certainly because they actually did it themselves. I think just one point on that, you know, when Edward Ericsson said about the you know, about the counterinsurgency model that was used by the British against the Boers, and the Spanish in Cuba, and the Americans in the Philippines, and the French in various parts of North Africa. You know, one point that should be made as apart from that as well is on the Ottomans' point, is that all those other counterinsurgency operations were parts of basically imperial expansionism. In other words, the British were fighting in South Africa, the Americans were fighting in the Philippines, the Spanish were fighting in Cuba, the French were fighting in North Africa. They weren't actually counterinsurgency operations defending their own citizens, which is like of the highest priority. So, I mean, any state should be able to understand that, I mean, if the British state had been invaded by the Germans in 1918 or whenever, or 1940, I know that in 1940, Churchill had the most, you know, extravagant plans of resistance, you know, people left behind, and you know, these states would have defended themselves to you know, by doing anything. So, you know, I think these arguments should have more resonance in the West. The problem, of course, in the West is essentially parliaments. Parliaments are very much, you know, they're vote machines, you know, and they're essentially just, they're also, you know, the current climate is very much unrealistic. It's like, well, we'll stick up for anybody that seems to be sort of like a victim of something or other, you know. No, of course, there's loads of victims, and there's victims over history. But, you know, the questions are, you know, this does not apply to all victims, as people have mentioned. You know, the Muslims were victims in Eastern Anatolia. And, you know, there's loads of victims all over the world, in America, Native Americans, Australia, Aborigines, etc. These aren't thought about. You know, there's a hierarchy of victims. That's the problem. And, you know, Pasdermadjian was very much into this hierarchy of victims, because his viewpoint was that Christian Armenians were a higher form of civilization, and these other people were lesser breeds. They were lower forms of civilization. And this chimed very well with imperialism, you know, Rudyard Kipling and all the sorts of writings of this time. So this is the problem. So I think, you know, we do need to do this type of research, and we do need to be putting this continually in context, because the Great War context, the counterinsurgency context, and other aspects I found out in my research, which I looked at the Royal Navy's official history of the blockade, which was a massive book produced. It was secret until 1963, the First World War blockade, and it's mostly about Germany, but it has a section at the very back about the blockade of Ottoman Turkey, and it says now in Europe, apparently it claims that the blockade was responsible for this is why it was suppressed by the British government itself. It claims that around about 750,000 Europeans were starved by the British blockade in the First World War. And I think that's pretty accurate. But what it claims really astonishingly in the last 10 or so pages, when it deals with the blockade of the Ottomans, is that it was more effective in the Ottoman Empire, that they actually managed to starve at a greater level people and inflict disease. Now, I've never seen anybody investigate this.
No, that's your next paper.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know where I can get this data. Maybe Turkish historians in Turkey can look. I don't know whether you can categorize deaths, but, you know, certainly the effect of blockade is you know, kills people at a much greater level than bullets do, you know, ordinary people, you know, because they're deprived of water, food, particularly food. It brings disease, it weakens their system. All these studies were done prior to the war because that's what they wanted to do against Germany. And so I think they would have achieved even greater against the Ottomans because the Germans were a highly developed, well-run, well-organized state. And, you know, with all due respect to the Ottomans, they weren't as well-run and well-organized as the German state in 1914, which was an extremely functional state. And in fact, it took 4 years for the Royal Navy blockade to break it down. So, you know, that shows what a good state it was. So, you know, I think some research needs to be done on that. And I don't, you know, within Turkey, and I don't know if it can be done, but, you know, about figures of death, maybe on the Turkish population and how much of them suffered, you know, starvation and death and things like this. And you know, I think that has to be brought out, you know, to try and, you know, question this figure, you know, that there's always bandied about that, you know, this supposedly 1.5 million or 1 million or whatever. We probably think it's around 650,000. But, you know, how much of this figure is actually due to the relocation and how much of it's to do with external forces and warfare and various other things that are obviously a consequence of the First World War, and as Edward Erickson says, they're a consequence of, you know, the Allied strategy of trying to destroy the Ottoman Empire from within by using its diversity, its great diversity of peoples in rebellion.
Anyway, in the US, the number of Armenians who died goes in parallel with the amount of donations to the congressman. We have noticed that. That is totally parallel. Anyway, that is very cynical, but it is the truth. Now, my last question, I know we're taking too much of your time. You have done work on the Karabakh War, the second war. So what do you see in future, very near future, about cooperation between Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Armenia? Turkey had open borders with Armenia in the beginning, and it had the best intentions. In fact, they were planning a Black Sea consortium, or some had good plans going on until Karabakh was invaded by the Armenians. Yeah. Do you see any hope that there will be cooperation economically, and this whole thing will subside, perhaps in the Caucasus, but mostly in the U.S. too? When U.S. sees, the Americans see that there is peace coming to that region, and Armenians are standing on their own feet now, it may deflate this balloon of genocide. So what do you predict?
Yeah, well, I mean, you raise a really important, you know, very, very interesting issue there, because when I was writing the book that will come out, I think in about a month's time, about the Karabakh War, and it is a much wider book. It's not really, it's a book about the war, yes, but it's actually a book about politics, economics, and the general political situation, both before the war, during the occupation, and during the war and after the war. You know, so now one thing I found that I hadn't realized at the time when I was researching it was actually exactly as you said, what, you know, the Turkish government, you know, in the late 80s, you know, before and the early 90s, sort of, until really probably the Hojali massacre, I'd say, it sort of bent over backwards to help the Armenians, I think. You know, they could have, what Armenia lost by their by their invasion of Karabakh was simply this, that Turkey would have provided them with the outlet to the West that would have developed their economy. If they had established good relations in 1990 with Turkey and in early 1991 and had not engaged in the usual sort of like territorial expansionism, the Armenian state, I think, would have become a functional state with a good economy, with good links to Eastern Anatolia, and there would possibly have been a type of accommodation and reconciliation growing out of this, because Turkey was helping them out of the Soviet Union, and it was helping them to develop as a new independent state. But the problem lies in this. The Armenians fell back into their same road, and that was essentially, you know, let's take this territory no matter what. So then they become dependent, more and more dependent on the Russians. And even when the Soviet system collapses, they're dependent on Yeltsin to win the war. And they're also then dependent on Russia afterwards. And now they're a virtual dependency of Russia. You know, Russia, they can hardly function without Russia. About a quarter of their population has migrated short term to work there. Their economy is very, very poor. It's basically the state is owned by Russia. It's a military base. So they have sacrificed their independence and sovereignty and the prospect of being an independent, functional state for territorial expansionism. Surprise, surprise. So at the end of the day, there is two scenarios possible. There's a pessimistic and an optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that the Armenians continue on the same road, and the same road is predictable. It's, oh, we've lost Karabakh. Let's build up our army again. One day the Azerbaijanis will weaken. Maybe the Aliyev government won't be there, right? They'll be weaker in some way or other. Their oil price will go down. They won't have what they have, and then we'll take back Karabakh. In that sort of scenario, the Armenians are continuing on the same path, and they will still continue the anti-Turkish, the genocide campaigning. That will just continue. So that's a predictable course. The positive course is that they actually say, look, this territorial expansionism, this anti-Turkism is getting us nowhere. We've had 100 years of this. And look where we are now. Look at Armenia today. Instead, what we need is an accommodation with all our neighbors, with Azerbaijan particularly, with Georgia, with Turkey, and to develop the infrastructure of the region, to make it independent of each other, then to tackle maybe the Karabakh, then the small rump of Karabakh that's left, try and sort out functional arrangements there in some way or other, while Armenia itself starts availing of maybe Azerbaijani oil and routes eastward into Anatolia, and maybe the corridor that goes through Zangezur between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan proper, or you know the outside the exclave, so to speak. So that's the positive thing, and through that maybe some form of dialogue opens up with Turkey about the events of 1915. Historians work together. Some sort of accommodation is brought about. Not necessarily that the Armenians see the Ottoman side or the Turkish side, but they just don't push this genocide thing. They see that it's a great tragedy. The events are described accurately, factually, and the conclusion comes to that unless we can live together, we'll die together. And essentially, that's the only alternatives, that we either live together on a piece of land or we die together on a piece of land. And that's the difference between the optimistic and the pessimistic thing. And I think I said in the conference earlier on that I was partaking in, it's essentially hope against history, because the optimistic view is a hopeful view, but unfortunately the pessimistic view is more backed up by history.
Yeah, that's excellent analysis. We hope that there are some changes in the power structure in the world, and things are moving towards east. Perhaps there'll be more preoccupation with that than small countries fighting each other in different parts of the world. But there are almost 70,000 Armenians coming from Armenia to Turkey to work. They are fine people with good education. Some helpers in the houses, I find they had PhDs, and they are warm, pleasant people. One thing I must say, in Turkey, the Turkish Republic, the horrible events happened to both people, that's for sure. But Turkey never really brought any animosity towards the Armenians, the Republic. I think perhaps this was a deliberate policy. So, because there were Armenians in Turkey, there were Greeks and Jews. Well, we never had problems with the Jewish communities, but Greeks and Armenians, we had struggles. But they were never mentioned in strong terms because we lived together and there would have been big polarizations. And I didn't know since I came in 1960, an innocent person, but the genocide issue just started in the 50s, I think. Then it wasn't, it was a policy issue between, to undermine, I don't know, there was a policy decision by big powers to encourage this genocide thing. Well, since 1970, I couldn't believe that is not any difference between the Armenian community in Turkey and then the Armenians here. So, so we need to resolve this. Anyway, it is difficult. You have been to Turkey, have you?
Oh yeah, I've been to Turkey on many occasions. I'd say, probably 10 or so. I've been to Azerbaijan about 10 times. And just on something you said there, because when I taught in international schools, I taught Armenians. It's the only time I've ever really, had any direct contact with Armenians, really. And the students I taught were the loveliest of students, and they were a really, really talented people. And I could see in those Armenians the talents that they have in writing, and in hard work, and in effort, and particularly in perfection. And to be honest, it made me think about it. I thought these people's talents are not used in the right way.
Yeah.
They're wasted. They're wasted. These people, I mean, obviously in the Ottoman Empire, their talents were recognized by the Ottoman sultans, and in other countries as well. But unfortunately, this is a road to disaster. Because in Ireland, if I look at our own experience, we've had obviously centuries of conflict with Britain, and we've had a peace agreement in 1998. But people, the bitterest of enemies, members of the IRA, the chief of staff of the IRA shook hands with the Queen. And there's no animosity between Irish and British people, and and Ireland's become an independent nation. We don't have this baggage. What happened in the past. The Great Famine. That obviously the Sultan supplied food and ships. A million people starving, million people going to, and we have like centuries of this, right? And Irish being killed and things like this. But we've made peace, and peace is there, and right. So we have occasional troubles, but Ireland actually recently, it regrets Britain leaving the EU. It was its closest neighbour. It would be great if one day the Armenians had this attitude to Turkey. Because the Armenian relationship with Turkey is not dissimilar to the Irish in perception. Is not dissimilar in perception. I say now, because I'm not comparing it exactly, but in perception, it's not different than the Irish historical relationship to Britain. I mean, we have a big power next to us. We feel that they've done us a lot of harm and wrong over history, but you make peace with people, and you have to do this. If you don't, you waste your talents in grievance and negativity, and I think that's what the Armenians have done. And I'm sorry about that, actually.
But in Turkey, I think they try. We are going to show the film of Ara Güler, there was a very good documentary, the famous Turkish-Armenian photographer. And I think I hear musicians and painters, and they are thriving in Turkey because it's just a much more peaceful atmosphere there. Well, thank you so much. This is priceless, and we hope we have you come and speak on the British-Ottoman relations and the Greek independence, which I heard a few months ago. There is much to talk, and you really are an amazing wealth of information and excellent academic work. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you again. And this program will be...
My pleasure entirely. My pleasure entirely.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad that we have the pandemic. We have the TASCTV. Now we can connect from all over the world. And thank you again very much.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.